Hello, Nerd Night. Are we ready to rock? I'm very old. I need notes. Sorry. In the autumn of 1986, the writers of the NME, 36 men and 6 women, decided to put together a list of the 100 greatest albums produced up until that time. If you want to follow that QR code, you can get your phones out, you will find the list. Pause for people doing that. If it doesn't work, it's Nick's fault.
We'll try to tweet it out. Yeah?
Does it work?
Would that work?
Yeah, good. You'll see there's only 99 records on that list. That's because the printed version from which it was copied missed out number 45, which was the Jam's All Mod Cons. So, after the list was published, the writers, the NME asked their readers what should be number 101 on the list. And they got lots of suggestions, and the one they chose was Frank Sinatra's Songs for Swinging Lovers. Now, this was quite a strange choice for the writers to make, because the record that they had chosen at number 101 was Hole by industrial noise pioneers scraping fetus from the wheel. one of the greatest names for a band ever. Nothing, I think, could sum up the unpredictable iconoclasm of the 1985 list better than that. But why should you care about a list of 100 records produced nearly 40 years ago? An internet search will summon you up many lists stranger than the ones the NME produced in the sixth year of Margaret Thatcher's reign. Well, since this is Nerd Night, let us crunch some numbers. In 1985, the UK had a population of 56.5 million. About 8 million of them were aged between 15 and 25. Let's say that 1 in 20 of them were passionate about music. Well, the NME was selling about 100,000 copies a week at that time. I should say, somebody said, does everyone know what the NME stands for? Yes. Yeah, the New Musical Express. That's what it stands for. It was selling about 100,000 copies a week at that time. It was widely shared at school, at university, in the pub. So you might say that it was read by, every copy was read by 2 people. So if you've got that, 8 million people aged between 15 and 25, and let's say 1 in 20 of them are music as obsessives, and you've got a readership, so that gives you a readership universe of about 1.6 million. You've got readership of the NME about 200,000. Maybe you could say 1 in 10-ish, something like that, of people who are really interested in music were reading the NME. So the NME doing something was a big deal at that time. And at that time, there was... The NME, along with its fellow weekly Inkies, Melody Maker and the Sounds, had dominated the music scene in the 1970s. Now, they weren't doing that in the 80s anymore. Magazines as different as The Face and Smash Hits had seen to that. But they were still pretty important. There was virtually no music on television. There was a strictly limited number of radio stations. There was a mere trickle of music books worth reading. If you wanted to know about music, if you wanted to learn about music, you read the Inkies. And in 1985, that included 18-year-old Noel Gallagher, the 18-year-old Brett Anderson, 17-year-old Damien Albarn. I've completely lost my track now because I haven't been looking at my notes. They said, my friend said, don't look at your notes. You look really old. Well, I'm going to look at my notes. Oh, I'm not even on the right slide. There we are. There, that was the one that's the slide I was meant to be when I was talking about England. This is England, the terrible Clash album from 1985. Get back on track. There's the NME, there's sounds, there's the melody maker. There were two other contrasting factors that made the NME list so important. One was that back then there was this idea that you could own the perfect record collection. Even then, the idea was nonsense. But there were books like this, very good book by Tom Hibbert, compiling, I don't know how many records there were in that book, 100 or so, which would make the perfect collection. And behind that was the idea that there was a set of criteria to which you could measure music against. And that some genres were more important than others. And you could apply this criteria in some sort of research. I think there's quite a few academics in the audience. You could apply this criteria to music, and it would come out, and an established, unchallenged list would be produced. Nonsense, of course, but it was still that view was still widely shared. The other reason the NME's list was so important, so influential, was that, and this is quite hard to grasp in an era when every era of music, every type of music has been analysed to the nth degree and a sort of a canon of great recordings established and socialised, was that in the sort of 4 decades immediately following the rewiring of teenagers' brains by Elvis Presley's hips, people didn't do that very often. In fact, the NME had only produced one other top 100 list, one in its entire history. NME started in the late 50s, in 1974. And then it did one in 1985, and then it waited until 1993 to do it again. So this was quite a big deal. So that's why I think you should care about this list. What about me? Why did I care? Well, everyone know who that is? Neil from the Young Ones. I went to university at exactly the same time as the Young Ones was being shown. I lived the Young Ones live. It wasn't any Motorhead had never played in my front room, sadly. So in 1985, in the autumn of 1985, I had been unemployed for 6 months, or on the dole, as we called it quaintly back then. I would spend another 8 months living in a bedsit above my dad's office. Because strangely, my 2-2 degree in communication theory from Coventry Polytechnic had not been the gateway to a glittering media career that I'd hoped to be. But eventually I did secure the prestigious position of editorial assistant on Window Trade News. But before I got that storied job, I had a lot of time on my hands. And this 1985 list, it sort of became my Rosetta Stone. It became my guide to the songs, the albums, the artists that were worth listening to and learning about. And I've carried that list with me from that bedsit. I moved to London, to another bedsit, to another flat, to flats across the capital for 36 years, finally to a house. And I still look at it every single day and contemplate its contradictions and its wisdom. You can come and touch it later. For a fee. So, as time's gone by, I've realised the NME list it's an unreliable guide. It's full of snobbery. It's dismissive of entire genres. And sometimes it's just a bit silly. So, but it's a product of a time when deciding which kind of music you liked had real personal, social, political consequences. Back then, you went round to see someone and they put on Sade's Diamond Life. You didn't go back. If you went round and they put on Crumbling the Antiseptic Beauty by Felt, while you discussed Paul Weller's decision to break up the Jam and form Soul Jazz as a style council, and likened it to the similar betrayal of Labour abandoning its commitment to unilateral nuclear disarmament, then things were fine. That was what life was like, as far as music was concerned, in the 1980s. I'm very conscious that we live in a world that is polarised on many things. Doesn't tend to be polarised about music. And in 1985, life was polarised amongst things about many music. Now, I'm personally glad that we live in an age where we live in a less divisive age when it comes to music. Partly because I quite like Diamond Life. Some really good tracks. And I actually prefer the Style Council to the Jam. Which, exactly. Well, exactly. I listened to it the other day. I definitely do. So, but I'm pleased to have lived through a period where, to misquote Bill Shankly, music felt more important than life and death. The 85 list is as much about attitude as it is about excellence. But I admire it for that. In the same way that I recognise the importance of punk, even the necessity of its ground zero stance, while still listening to a lot of the music that it rejected. I love all kinds of music, and I wouldn't reject any based on genre or era or the politics of its creator. Van Morrison, I give you that. But sometimes it's all good approach to music makes everything feel a bit bland, as if music is a big supermarket which you could just browse at your leisure. And the 85 list is a reminder of a more passionate and polarised time. It's also full of the kind of errors that you get immediately in the wake of a revolution. I also think, more of this later, that it absolutely encapsulates the clearest dividing line between the two schools of pop taste. But I'll come to that later. So, let's get stuck into the list, shall we? Now, at the first glance, you look at that list and you see one thing. Rock is dead. And not only is it dead, but its previous domination of the great records of all time, and the people who put them in that place have been swept away by punk. And that's a great thing as far as the 1985 list is concerned. So I'll read a bit here from the intro. So in the intro to the list, the legendary NME scribe, Danny Kelly, remarks on the 85's list, commendable distaste for most manifestations of willy-waving old grunge rock. Another genre I'm particularly fond of, by the way. That's my friend Jeff here. New wave British heavy metal, anyone? No, never mind. But Kelly is only warming up. His real ire is reserved for the NME's original 1974 list. I quote, "Even allowing for the fact that the 74 poll was conducted before punk, it's hard to be just a little astonished at some of the drivel lurking in it." I may be about to insult some of your favourite artists, so remember it's Danny Kelly's words, not mine. Jethro Tull, the singing grow bag. Yes, James Taylor's vinyl anaesthetic. The Pink Floyd LP that always sounded like they wore rubber gloves recording it. Yes, they're all here. And lurking, he continues, in equal number one spot is the Beatles' Exocet missile to the very heart of rock music, the stupendously overrated, the ultimately damaging, what am I going to say? Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. By 1988, so 3 years later, the NME would produce a tribute album to Sgt. Pepper's, featuring indie titans The Fall, Billy Bragg, and Wet, Wet, Wet. And by 1993, Sgt. Pepper's would be back at number 33 in that all-time top 100 list, the third list. As far as I'm concerned, ever since I read Danny Kelly's dismissal, in my mind, it's a novelty record with an iconic record sleeve and 2 decent tracks. Such are the strange ways that at least my music taste is concerned. So, the lineup of the bands and artists that dominated the 70s list and been expunged by the 1980s is very instructive. Gone are The Who. Gone is Frank Zappa, both of whom had 3 albums in the list. Gone are Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Traffic, Rod Stewart and Neil Young, each of which had 2 albums in the 74 list. I would say that really only Neil Young, largely thanks to Sonic Youth, and its adoption by the grunge scene and the fact that he's kept churning out albums and touring, I think only Neil Young has really had any sort of critical comeback since that time. I just stress that because I think there was a dividing line here in 85, which I'll come back to. But perhaps the biggest fall of grace comes in the form of a band whose albums constituted 7% of the top 100 in 1974, but reduced to just 1% of the 1985 list. Anyone want to guess what that band is? Yes, well done. Yeah, that's right. So there were 7 Rolling Stones albums in the 1974 top 100. By 1985, only the Connoisseurs Stones album, Exile on Main Street. Anybody ever ask you know nothing about the Rolling Stones, to say which is the Rolling Stones' best albums, always say Exile on Main Street. You'll just look cool. Kelly's vitriol spills over into the 80s with glee. He notes that some groups with egos the size of South American republics, including Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, and the Police, recording artists of the 1980s, my lord, did no better than the Lambrettas, Judge Dredd, Plastic Bertrand, Hazel O'Connor, and Rolf Harris. Rolf Harris didn't mean what it means now, so be interesting. But still, you know, when the writers' votes were conducted. But it's not just the rejection of rock's hoary past that makes the 1985 list so interesting. It's full of really fascinating themes. Oh, there's Sergeant Pepper's. Should you? No, I'm totally. All right, good. Oh, indeed. Exactly. Perhaps the most striking thing about the 1985 list is it includes 14 records released before 1974 that weren't in the 74 list, including this record, which sits pretty, as you'll have seen if you've followed the QR code, at number 1. Now, what's going on in the sort of 11 years following 74, this record's star hasn't as much risen as supernovaed. Its musical excellence apart, it had become widely recognised at the first time a black artist had wrestled control from their record company and produced an album on their own terms. Before What's Going On, albums by a black artist, particularly black soul artists, tend to be very patchy affairs. 2 or 3 timeless singles, and then lots of filler cover versions of other hits and records that just weren't good enough for the hit parade, literally just filling up the record. Their best music was collected on compilation records, and that's what you did with soul artists. But a lot of tastemakers think, well, you can't have compilation records in top 100. It's unfair because it's collecting somebody's best records. And also, albums are all about, putting together tracks, some of them which don't have commercial value. I don't know, I've got a posh voice, but I'm imagining I'm a member of Genesis. Okay, so, and it's sort of unfair. But as we can also see, that by excluding compilation albums, as largely happened in the 74 list and most other top 100, unintentionally or intentionally, that is a racist act because you're actually excluding a lot of black artists. Now, the NME list, one of the best thing about it is it rejects that convention and it includes compilations. There are 14 compilation albums in the 85 list, 11 of them by black artists. And they also include 3 records which are sort of standard bearers for great jazz. In a Silent Way, A Love Supreme, and Kind of Blue. And together with those compilations, you get about a quarter of the list are by black artists. Now, people say it may be higher, but that was a very significant increase on what had been in the past. And, these rejigging of the rules to include compilation albums, it might seem like the kind of thing that is of interest, really to, nerds. But actually, in the mid-80s, and I can remember the mid-80s, in the mid-80s, racist views were widely and openly held right throughout British society, not just by, they were everywhere. So making this statement for a mainstream publication, the NME was, as I say, selling 100,000 copies. It was a big deal. It was a bold statement for the NME to make. Now, if kicking against the racist pricks was the serious side of the 85 list, the other side of it was its sheer delightful strangeness. So let's have a little bit of look at that. Let's start with the pièce de résistance. Sitting pretty at number 6, the 6th greatest album of all time, is an album that begins with a song about a mutant dwarf community living under New York City. Or so the ever unreliable Tom Waits would have us believe. As a cri de coeur to challenge convention, I've never seen its equal in 40 years of reading about music. The reader, having got over that shock, perhaps the shock of what's going in, coming in at what's going on? Sorry, what's coming in? What's coming in? The lesser known sequel to What's Going On. having got over the shock of what's going on being number one, were then presented by the fact that the greatest album that John Lennon ever appeared on was 1970s Plastic Ono's band. Better than any Beatles album. Better than any Beatles album. And after that, surprises keep on coming with satisfying regularity. So, squeezed between two very different black guitar heroes, Jimi Hendrix and Robert Johnson. And number 29 comes the debut album for Cleveland's answer to the Joy Division, Pere Ubu. If you haven't heard Pere Ubu and you like Joy Division, listen to Pere Ubu. Whilst at 41, with Brian Eno's Another Green World, we have the arrival of ambient music at a time when people who knew what the word ambient meant usually associated it with temperature. But perhaps my favourite pick comes at number 55 with the Mad Not Mad album by Madness. This is a record so atypical in its nature compared to the band's previous output, and so dripping with urban melancholy, it could easily sit alongside anything that Ray Davies produced in his 60s heyday. If you like that kind of stuff and you've never heard this record, please listen to it. It's a really beautiful record. Baggy trousers, it is not. Not there's anything wrong with baggy trousers. Absolutely fantastic album. And album. And let me make it clear, these album choices, they're not just like some willful showing off just to prove the eclecticism of the records. These are all really good and sometimes great records that have sometimes just slipped to the margins of pop history. Yes, sometimes the writers chose the wrong record. You're about number 40 or something like that. There's Bobby Womack's The Poet, which is a good record, but as time has gone on, the idea that that record should be the flag bearer for contemporary black music at that time rather than Prince's 1999 or Purple Rain is a bit odd. But mostly the supposedly strange picks, and I have only mentioned but a few, tell a compelling alternative history of popular music up to that point. But it's not just individual records that, through individual records that challenge the list challenges popular music's accepted hierarchy. Elvis Costello has 5 records in the top 100. That's one more than the 4 the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and David Bowie have. And had I more time, I'd talk a lot more about that because it's really interesting how very important Elvis Costello was in the 80s. And because he moved to America and done all his work in America now, has become much less important. But he was up there. He was up there in the 80s. The Velvet Underground, Roxy Music, Talking Heads, all got 3 albums in there, as do the Despoilers of the 60s Party, The Doors. Strange days indeed. Even the albums chosen from the discographies of rock's giants tell a story. The 4 Bowie albums chosen are all released between 75 and 77, so a 3-year period. Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory obviously being considered too rock for inclusion in the list. One other small, final, delightful quirk in this quirk-shodden list can be found at number 51 with the Impressions compilation album, The Big 16, which was exactly the same number it got in 74. Exactly the same number. Examine the 1993 list, the third list, and you won't see such a clear sort of reorientation in critical assessment. Just to show a slow shuffling of classics into what's now become a sort of widely accepted consensus. Consensus, a word as abhorrent to the writers of the NME in the 1980s as it was to the Thatcherite shock troops that were busy remaking society at that time. The well-established consensus that I referred to usually suggests that 67 was the high watermark of popular music, and a storied year it undoubtedly was. But as far as the NME's 1985 crop of writers were concerned, the year they thought music shone brighter than any other was exactly a decade later. So 1977 saw debuts from The Clash, from the Sex Pistols, from television, from the Ramones, the Talking Heads, and Elvis Costello. Records which redefined popular music's relationship with electronic sounds. 2 from David Bowie, Kraftwerk, and Suicide. A band incredibly influential in the 80s who, as I say, slipped to pop margins. A new dawn had broken in popular music. And it had arrived in a frenzy of sneering, garage rock riffing, uneasy funk, and what did I say? Uneasy funk, churning synthesizers. I knew it was worth checking. I'd had bleeping synthesizers. That's rubbish. Churning synthesizers, much better. I think you'll agree. It's sometimes said that at heart, music lovers are either Beatles fans or Elvis Presley fans. That sort of rings true for me. Gut feel versus imagination, physicality versus intellect, passion versus calculation. Personally, I'm in the former camp, despite, or maybe because I knew the words to 20 Beatles songs before I would ever have considered myself a music fan. I've always thought that Presley's pre-Army records had a magic and mystery about them the Fab Four, for all their brilliance, never equalled. But I'd argue that the real divide in musical taste, divide's not the right word, the two camps, shall we say, is best captured by the 74 and 85 lists. Not the actual albums they contain, of course. Indeed, the concept of an album is increasingly irrelevant in our Spotified world. No, I mean the values they express, the virtues they hold dear. The 74 list, it was weed and cocaine. It was swinging London and sunny California. It was Frank Zappa sticking it to the man. It was recording with the London Symphonic Orchestra. It was Sgt. Pepper's hazy, melancholic joy. 85 was speed and heroin. It was London burning with boredom. It was the sticky floor at CBGB's. That's the toilet at CBGB's. It was a train ride through a blacked out East Berlin. It was Three Chords and the Truth. It was What's Going On, Soulful Angst. It was Elvis Costello's Neurotic Tales from the Dark Side. When you put on a record, at least one that's main purpose is not to make you dance, most times I think you choose between those two feelings. So there you have it. A short history of the NME's 1985 Top 100 list. A list which, as Danny Kelly wrote in his entry, is both profoundly irrelevant and, as at least I hope I've partly convinced you, intensely important. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I will start with a question that we got from someone watching at home. Alastair, what's the drivel lurking in the 85 list, in your opinion? And what's your favorite album, yes, just one, on the list? And what's the biggest omission? No, you don't, because I said it.
Oh yes. Is there drivel on this list? There's not a lot of drivel on this list. There really isn't. There's some records that I think, they're doing well to be on it. If there's one record that you haven't, there may be a few records that you haven't listened to, but if you've never listened to Marquee Moon by Television, you should listen to Marquee Moon by Television. I would say Prince is the obvious admission, you know, from that list. That's the one that really, you know, if they'd done this list 3 years later, there'd be like 4 Prince albums in it. You know, I think Prince is the only thing I might say about this list is the follow-up to Swordfish Trombones, Rain Dogs, is even a better album. So it's quite, you know, in a way, Swordfish Trombones is in there for its sheer shock factor. Barney Hoskins, who was one of the writers who invited, who voted this, and who I invited here today, but sadly couldn't make it. He wrote in his biography of Tom Waits how, you know, Swordfish Trombones arrived in the NME office and people just couldn't understand. If you've never heard Swordfish Trombones, please listen to Swordfish Trombones. It's an astonishing record. But Rain Dogs, its follow-up is even better. Though Frank, there's 3 records in that trilogy. Frank's Wild Years is the third one. Nowhere near as good as the other one. But then everything else he's done since then has been genius.
Excellent. We have a question over there.
Great talk, thank you. You made mention about the Spotify generation, and the increasing kind of irrelevance of the album. Do you think that matters, and why?
Can you now repeat the question?
Yes. Thank you. Does it matter that albums don't matter anymore? Well, of course albums do matter because you've got the resurgence of vinyl. You know, you only have to see the queue at Record Store Day to see that, you know, albums do matter to certain type of people. You, as proud nerds, will be familiar with the concept of the beauty of constraints, and there is something about the beauty of constraints. You've got 2 sides of vinyl. You've got 40 minutes. How are you going to use that time to, you know, get over whatever you want to do? And that constraint produced great art. When we moved to CDs and you had 60 minutes over one side, did albums suddenly get better? No, they did not. No, they didn't. So there was something about, I think there is something magical about 40 minutes on 2 sides. I don't know what it is. And I think, you know, so I think we have lost something. We've also gained something, you know. There's a really great book called Every Song Ever by New York Times music critic, whose name escapes me for the moment. But it's a really fantastic book about how to listen to music when you can listen to every song ever recorded, just, you know, at any time. He's sort of suggesting forms that might replace albums. So he talks about listening to lots of records which have repetition as their theme from different genres, or are very slow from different genres and things like that. So there are ways to listen to music now that are just as interesting and, you know, illuminating as when the album was, you know, the sort of the highest expression form of music. But the album did have something inherent in itself. I think the pre-CD album had something inherent in it, which is something to do with the beauty of constraints, if that makes sense.
Can you repeat the name of the book, please?
The name of the one I just mentioned, yes, please. Every Song Ever. It's a really good book.
We had a question here.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for the talk. I was really interested in the kind of racial politics that you were discussing with the list. I wondered whether there's anything that kind of the Oscar panels in Hollywood could learn from NME's big kind of approach in terms of that understanding of genres and rewarding black artists in the same way that the Oscar panels have been scrutinized.
Yeah, I may have given the impression that the inclusion of all the black artists in the 85 list was some sort of high-minded exercise. It was largely because, as with most music magazines, you have groups of journalists working for them who are at war with each other all the time. And there was a group of journalists at the NME who really loved soul music and black music in general, and they were determined that their, the music they loved would get a showing, and they indulged in lots of underhand and various tactics to do that. So I wouldn't hold up, it's a list produced by 36 people who were drunk and stoned. It's not any kind of model that should be built on. It's no model for any kind of sort of institutional way of doing things. The NME in the 1980s, Pat Long wrote a very interesting history about the NME, which is worth reading if you're interested in how musical taste was shaped in the 60s and 70s and early 90s. So no, I don't think there are any lessons. It's not that kind of story, I'm afraid.
Any more questions? One there.
I'm just wondering if you've ever looked at similar lists produced in a similar era by different groups of people or different publications to see how they compare.
Yeah, well, I'm a nerd. I look at lists all the time. Indeed, I have books of lists, as I'm sure you all do. So, and I have, and you know what? There's something different about the 85 list. I think because it was a product. I've carried this around for a long time. I've written this speech in my head for 30 years. I am not kidding you. Nobody. It won't happen, but I would like to write a book about it, because I think what was really interesting was that it was the mix of people who were choosing the records, the magazine that they were working for, the paper they were working for, and the time in which they were working, a time when there was consensus really was a dirty word. So it was a real battle between the types of things. Whereas most lists produced by most magazines and things like that tend to be the product of people who think broadly the same. They like the same kind of music. They work for a hip hop magazine. They like hip hop. There was something about the NME in 1985 where you still had old hippies like Charles Shaar Murray, and you had people like Stephen Wells, Seething Wells, who was an anarchist poet. David Quantock, who's went on to write Veep and worked with Amanda Iannucci. You had such a wide range of people that it just produced something very strange and something very, very wonderful. There are lots of great lists out there, and I spend a lot of time looking at them. And as I do, I find that the 85 list sort of stands apart because it's got a great story associated with it.
We have a question here from the fun group.
So were there any more women in 85 than there were in 74?
It's a good question. Well, one of the things that I didn't, so there are 6 women artists in 85, which is not very many. I can't remember what there is 74. But I think there were. I mean, so certainly there are a lot more black artists, but there aren't a lot of women artists. There's 6 in the 6 out of 100, which is pretty disgraceful. There's no Nina Simone in that in that list, for example, which is ridiculous. a best of Nina Simone should be the list. And I think it is interesting how racial politics, as much as I can give it that title, which is just that bubbled up and made an impact on that list, but sort of gender politics didn't at that time. I sort of made the point at the start that there were 36 men and 6 women, so that made a difference. It is the thing that I think runs consistently through most lists of great records, that women artists are underrepresented in them, largely because most pop writers are men.
It's been a great night for women here. More questions. Come on, any more questions? There's one over there.
I just wanted to know, you named some albums that you have to listen to like 195 years. Do you have anything from the last 5 or 10 years that you need to listen to?
Have you listened to it? Have you listened to any actual...
So, can you just remind us of the songs that your dad rock band are learning, Andy? The Comet is Coming. People like The Comet is Coming. Fantastic band. Really. Sorry? So yeah. God, Nina, help me out. Yeah, tonight. I mean, I listen. I'm an old bloke who lives in Stoke Newington. Saying I listen to a lot of world music is really going to put me in a fucking box, isn't it? Last band I went to see was Orchestra Baobab, a band who were formed in 1970, and are all dead. They are all dead. They're all dead. And just there are various people playing their music and things like that. But Comet is Coming. There are others. John Murray. Yep. John Murray, brilliant. Particularly his first album. See me after, I'll give you a list. Sorry, I can't think of... I mean, I really like Ghostbox records, but, that's because I like music that sounds like 1970s TV theme tunes. So I fear I may lead you astray if I gave you too many suggestions.
Fantastic. Any more questions? There's one last one. Make it good.
There has just been a cultural shift moving away from albums. There's also been a cultural shift of the loss of a common single channel for consumption. Pre-internet, during these times, the only place that people had to listen to these things were much broader channels that were shared with everyone. Radio. I can't remember the last time I listened to a live radio station. And this is judged from Spotify, it's not just the albums. So how does that affect your ability to even judge what might be a top 100 list right now?
Yeah, well, of course, and that's absolutely right. I mean, but at the same time, I think we live in an era where shared experiences have never felt more important. All these immersive things like secret cinema and things like that, which I absolutely love, and the growth of festivals. I went to Glastonbury in 1987, my first Glastonbury, 25,000 people. Now it's 225,000 people because people enjoy that shared experience. Being in a big festival crowd, singing along with everyone. I don't think people have lost that need or desire for that shared experience. Look at you all out on a Wednesday night. for this. This is like really late. I'm probably the only person who's thinking, bloody hell, the babysitter's going to cost a lot of money. But you're right. We have lost a certain way of sharing music, but I think there are plenty of others anywhere. And I talked about the 3 lists: the 74 list, the 85, and the 93 list. There've been the NME's done other lists since then, 2003, and they did its 500 greatest albums of all time and things like that. But I think the internet changed everything. It just changed everything. Not necessarily for better or worse. It just changed everything. Basically, it meant that just those 3 lists were produced by 50 odd music writers. So it wasn't any kind of list of one person deciding they wanted a record particularly high would make a big difference. It's the story that goes on with it that I think makes these lists compelling. So yes, I think it's impossible now to say these are the best records of all time, and that is a wonderful thing, because that actually that's no way to think about music. Music had to go through that period, and it learned stuff in doing so. But we're now in a period which is much better, where we can admit that Diamond Life is a great album and the Style Council are better than the Jam.